Hi YouTube, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be meeting in the kitchen once again to go through something that I think is so important and genuinely is one of the most common reasons why you might not be seeing the kind of progress that you're wanting to see. And this is around tracking food. And I think often with tracking, it can be just assumed that you know exactly how to do it. You just come out of the womb knowing how to track. And that couldn't really be further from the truth. It is definitely a skill, and there are ways of doing it right, also ways of doing it wrong, which can really vary what your actual intake is versus what you think your intake is. Something that happens often when clients start working with me is they'll say something like, I've been sticking to this calorie goal consistently for weeks. Absolutely nothing has changed. And a lot of the time that calorie goal is quite low, and based on what I know about them, should be a deficit, should elicit fat loss pretty effectively. But for one reason or another, it is just not happening. When I then take a look at food logs and I see how tracking is being done, I can spot some really obvious things that aren't quite right. So we are going to be tracking properly today. I'm going to show you exactly how I track my meals, and I thought I would do this at the same time that I'm cooking my dinner, because two birds, one stone and all that jazz. When it comes to tracking, why do we do it in the first place? Obviously to hit a particular calorie target, right? That is the main goal when we're thinking about fat loss, but also so that we're aware of what we're eating, what is in our food. And actually it's a skill that once we have, we can absolutely move away from. I do not suggest that anybody tracks their food every day for the rest of their life. That sounds incredibly dull and also just not sustainable as a habit, right? But it is something that at least initially I would recommend doing pretty accurately to build up that base of nutritional IQ so that you know what is in your food, how we figure out things like portion sizes, and also how we can spot patterns around our food, right? When are we most hungry throughout the day? When do we notice that cravings kick in a little bit more, potentially around your menstrual cycle, or when you've had a particularly bad night's sleep or a stressful day at work? All of these things are really helpful for us because we can spot those patterns and therefore help you to mitigate against any of those issues in the future. When we think about tracking, there are a few things we're going to need. Number one, MyFitnessPal, or similar, but today we're going to be running through MyFitnessPal as the software of choice. We are also going to need a food scale, a digital food scale. Now you might be thinking, that sounds a bit obsessive. I disagree, respectfully, because you don't know how much 200 grams of chicken breast is. You don't know. And actually, when we think about the research, nutritionists, dietitians, they don't know either. And I don't know, right? Until we've put the practice in to figure out what portion sizes actually look like, we simply are guessing. We're going to get on to how to use this and best practices for weighing food. A few things we want to bear in mind first. In an ideal world, we want to be tracking before we eat, not after. Not only is our memory quite unreliable, but again, we don't know how much food we've just eaten if we haven't tracked it and accounted for it, right? We want to track before we eat wherever we can. Something I quite like doing is tracking the night before. If I'm in a particular phase where I'm tracking, then I'll track the night before the food that I know I'm going to be eating. Obviously, you don't know all of it, but you might know I always have my oat bowl for breakfast. I always have my protein shake and a rice cake and a banana at 3 o'clock as my afternoon snack. Those are kind of my go-to meals. They don't really change that much. That's what I'm going to have tomorrow. So I'll pre-track it. And then it just means you don't have to spend your day where things are busy and you're doing other stuff tracking at the time. We're trying to reduce that as much as possible. That's a little tip around pre-tracking. You also want to think about how you weigh your food, right? So are we weighing food cooked or are we weighing food raw? Because it makes a big difference. If you think about a jacket potato, prime example, you pick a potato out of the fridge, it's pretty weighty. You put it in the oven for 2 hours, it's literally half the size in terms of weight, right? It's a big difference. It doesn't really matter whether you cook, whether you track even cooked or raw, but just stick to one and do that consistently. Now we've got those out of the way, we will start actually tracking. There's a couple of other things that we will learn along the way about how to make sure we're tracking effectively. Let's get going. This evening, I'm going to be making myself a nice little beef bowl with some stir-fry strips of beef. I'm going to make some sort of Chinese-y sauce to go with it. Probably not authentic, but I'll shove some things together. Some rice and some vegetables. Let's get started. So I need my rice. I've got my beef, and then I'm going to make my sauce. Some soy, some garlic, some ginger, maybe a bit of sriracha. Why not? Also, these Lazy Susans are incredible. I don't know if you guys have seen these, but they're unreal. Fish sauce, that might be it. And maybe some honey. Something that I think people just kind of forget about. I don't think it's intentional, but they just kind of forget about oil. And it's really calorie dense. Obviously, it's something you have to have when you're cooking food. If you want it to taste good, you've got to cook it in some oil. So we have some, right? But we also want to make sure that we're accounting for it. A tablespoon of olive oil is roughly 120 calories. I know that from the years of tracking, but when you're new, we do want to use our scale. Now, in this scenario, we are going to want to weigh this out. Technically, with oil, you could just get a tablespoon, right? Because actually, the consistency of it means if you do over a tablespoon, then it's just going to pour over the edge, right? But for the sake of this video, I'm going to do everything weighed on my scale. So first thing you want to do is put your little cooking implement on the scale. You then want to zero the scale so that it reads as 0. I'm going to change the unit to milliliters. For me, I work on the metric system, so I'm going to go milliliters, grams, kilos, right? 0 milliliters currently. As I'm adding in my olive oil, I will know when it gets to 15. Oh, 15. Stay. So that is 15 milliliters of olive oil. And then when it comes to my beef that I'm going to be using, luckily there is a nice little barcode on the bottom here. MyFitnessPal has a function that you can just capture that barcode and it will come up with the food that you're looking for. It also says how many grams this is, 357 grams. I'm going to cook this whole thing. Now, if your meat or whatever you're using doesn't have a barcode on it, that's fine. You don't need to track with the exact barcode. But what I don't want you to do is find chicken breast and then just choose one medium chicken breast. Because like, what is a medium chicken breast? Again, we do want, where possible, to be getting grams, actually weighing it. Chicken breast is probably not the best example because like you're not going to go too overboard with one medium chicken breast. But where you can slip up with this is saying something like 1 small bowl of pasta. Well, your small bowl and my small bowl might not be the same kind of small, right?
So now it's time to plate up, and the first thing I'm going to do is zero my scales, and I'm going to be adding in my rice. So I'm looking for white rice within MyFitnessPal, and I'm going to choose one with a little green tick to say it's kind of verified, if you like. And then I'm going to make sure that the units are in grams, and I'm going to go for 200 grams here. Then I'm going to do the same thing for my beef strips. So I could have just scanned the barcode in this case, but if you don't have a barcode or you don't want to do that, you just want to type in the exact words on the label. That's going to be the most accurate thing. So in this case, Ocado beef stir fry strips. So I found that exact entry. And it's defaulted me here to 100 grams, but I'm going to add 1 gram and then I'm going to say how many grams. So 150 in this case, or 149, which is close enough. And then frankly, we are not worried about the green beans. Okay. We do not need to track green veg. It is minimal calories, and also sriracha is very low calorie too, but you could track this if you wanted to. We're just trying to make this as easy as we possibly can.
So when we put this all together, what we're thinking about is capturing the main components. In this scenario, that's the beef, the rice, and what I use to cook it in, the oil, right? There is also some veg, we're not tracking that, and there is a sauce that I made here too. Now, I know looking at labels that the sauce isn't worth tracking. We're talking about some soy sauce, very low calorie. Sriracha, low calorie. Fish sauce, basically negligible. Things like garlic and ginger, again, negligible. I know that because I've looked at labels and figured out whether it's worth tracking or not. Things like sauces and spices, usually when we're thinking about like cooking ingredients rather than condiments,
two different things. Things like ketchup, mayonnaise, definitely worth tracking, pretty heavy in calories. But things like cooking sauces, usually, like, they are extremely low calorie. I would absolutely get into the habit of looking at labels and thinking about whether it's something you need to worry about tracking. If you're using 10 milliliters of something that's maybe 140 calories for 100 milliliters, then you're talking about 14 calories, right? It's not worth my time to track that. If I was having a burger and chips, I would be tracking the burger, the bun, the chips, the oil, and then any condiments I'm adding on, ketchup, mayonnaise, mustard, usually worth tracking. Get into the habit of looking at those labels and thinking about whether tracking is needed for the ingredients that you're putting on your plate. Generally, things like oils, butters, cream, anything kind of dairy based, cheeses, all of that tends to be pretty high calorie and worth tracking. But you don't need to stress yourself about seasoning and spices. It's not worth your time plugging in paprika for 1 calorie. This is just a way of making tracking harder. I would definitely encourage you to make your meals a little bit more interesting. Use these sauces and spices to help bring that flavor. Generally, hot sauces are very low calorie, like Cholula, Tabasco, those sorts of things, sriracha, are very low cal. So use those to create that flavor. Generally, fresh salsas, which is basically just chopped tomatoes and onions, very low calorie. Use that. Whereas things like sour cream, again, dairy and guacamole, avocado, high in fat, good fats, but still calorie dense. Track those things, get used to what these things actually include. And this is where tracking can be so helpful in informing you. And you can kind of see how, in the way I weighed out that rice 10 minutes ago, you can kind of see how once you've done that 5, 10, 15 times, you get pretty good eyeballing what 200 grams of rice looks like, right? Because you've done it 1,000 times. You've watched how much you've put into the bowl and what's happened to the scale. And this is where tracking not being a long-term tool really becomes evident. Because again, once you have that knowledge, you can start seeing the plates that you're building. You don't need to worry about tracking that again and again and again. We're always wanting to make tracking as easy as we can do. And another way, so tracking the main components, not stressing about the low calorie stuff. Another way of making that really simple is by eating fairly similar meals. For me, for example, if I'm in the middle of a busy week, I am not thinking about 7 different breakfast, lunches, and dinners that I can cook that week. I'm almost always having the same breakfast. I just cycle through the same one that I'm hyper fixated on at the time, and then I get really bored of it after a few months because it's easy, because I know it hits my goals around starting the day with a high source of protein, a high source of carb, a high source of fiber. And I also know that it takes that mental decision fatigue away from me in the busiest time of my day, which is generally in the morning. If I'm not with clients, then I'm up early to the gym before I sit down at my desk. So that is my busiest time. I make sure I'm kind of automating those meals. Once I've tracked it once, you can literally just swipe right and add that same meal in the next day. The more you can do that, the easier tracking becomes. So I'm not saying eat the same thing every day for every meal, but just think about your busiest time and what meal makes sense for you to try and automate, even if it means you have 2 options for your lunch this week, because that's your busiest time and you don't really have the mental bandwidth to be thinking about a new recipe to come up with on the day. So to sum up, we want to be tracking before we eat, not afterwards. We want to weigh our food for accuracy, at least in the beginning. Where possible, use accurate and verified entries within your meal tracking database. Track oils, high calorie sources, and dressings. Pick a unit of measurement that you are happy to stick to. And along the way, make the effort to understand what that portion size looks like. Get it ingrained in your brain, roughly what those portions actually weigh out at and what they look like on a plate, and really take the time to start looking at nutrition labels, thinking about whether it's worth tracking or not, and thinking about smart swaps that you can make in order to keep calories a little lower. And lastly, where possible, repeat meals that you know are easy to track and that you actually enjoy. That is the key to making tracking easy, but also making fat loss easy.